Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm back with a new video, and today I'm going to be discussing part 2 of the absurdity of atheism. But before I get started, first of all, I'd like to congratulate and show my appreciation for my dear atheist brethren out there who actually took the time a couple weeks ago when I put out the first video to watch it in full. A lot of them did, and at least attempt to critique it. So I appreciate that. However, I caught a lot of flack from the atheist community about what the definition of atheism is. They still insist that it's simply a lack of belief in God and not the proposition that there is no God. So I'm just going to go over that topic again briefly to show where they are in error on this subject. Now, in the last video, I went over the standard classical definition of the term. Atheism is the position that there is no God. Now, the modern atheists believe that atheism is best defined as a lack of belief in a God or gods. However, I want to know, is this the classical understanding of the term? Okay. And if not, who proposed this new popular definition? When did they propose it? And why did they propose it? Now, I briefly brought up this question in some Facebook groups and asked a few of my atheist friends, and they could not answer these questions. So I am now going to provide the answers for these questions. Okay? So, who is the one who proposed this new definition of atheism, or the atheist? Well, it was by a philosopher by the name of Antony Flew in 1976 in a paper entitled The Presumption of Atheism, which has now become very popular. It initially didn't receive such a great response, but the popular atheists have now completely run with this definition and this so-called presumption of atheism without really knowing the history of it and why this definition was proposed. Okay? So, we know who it was. It was by Antony Flew. When it was, 1976. Now let's look from the horse's own mouth, Antony Flew. Why did it change? Why did he propose this new definition? I'm going to quote from this paper, The Presumption of Atheism by Antony Flew in 1976. Okay? He says, and I quote, "What I want to examine is the contention that the debate about the existence of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, that the onus of proof must lie upon the theist." So he goes to explain that he wants in the debate about God's existence for the onus of proof to lie entirely upon the theist. Now look what he says. "The word atheism, however, has in this contention to be construed what? Unusually. You see? So in order for the burden of proof to lie entirely upon the theist in the God question debate, the word atheism, Flew admits, must be construed unusually. And he goes on to explain what's so unusual about this. He says, whereas nowadays, and that means in 1976, the usual meaning of atheist in English is, quote, someone who asserts that there is no such being as God. He says, I want the word to be understood not positively, but negatively. He then goes on to say, in this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. You see? He says the introduction of this new interpretation of the word atheism may appear to be a piece of perverse Humpty Dumptyism, going arbitrarily against established common usage. Why ever it could be asked, don't you make it not the presumption of atheism, but the presumption of agnosticism? Now, why does he make that question, that rhetorical question at the end? Because he anticipates this as a potential criticism for the redefinition of the term, okay? Because this whole lack of belief thing is much more akin to the classical understanding of agnosticism and not atheism. You see, but Flew, for whatever reason, wanted to call himself an atheist, okay, but yet he did not want to bear any burden of proof in the God debate question. Now, in order to get out of this problem, he has to propose a new, by his own admission, new definition of the term atheism to remove any burden of proof from him in this discussion. Okay? He says it has to be, the definition has to be construed unusually in order to do this. Okay? Then he goes on to cite what the typical definition of atheism in English was at that time. And he says it's the person who asserts that there is no God. Then he says, I want the word to be understood as blah, blah, blah. So this was completely by his own whim, you see. So, It's quite interesting that I got a lot of flack for this, and it's simply because the atheists don't know the history of atheism and the term and where these things that they're parroting come from. Okay? Now, this is by a professional philosopher in the field at that time. He quotes what the standard definition in English was at that time. He quotes why he wanted it to be changed, because the definition of atheism is directly linked to the burden of proof issue. Okay? And he states that it was commonly held amongst atheists and theists alike that at that time, based on the conventional and the commonly understood definition of atheism at that time, that both the atheist and theist alike had some burden of proof in the God discussion, and he wanted to eradicate that. Okay? So please, before you criticize me, do your homework, watch this video, understand what I said. Now, if you reject what Flew is saying in here, okay, then you have to show some kind of evidence that he's wrong about his assertions here. Because he's claiming that your definition that you're using today is not what the established one was at that time. Okay, so let's get our facts straight. Now, I had somebody comment on my last YouTube video and say this, quote, trying to change common word usage is like screaming into a hurricane. Good luck with that. And he's basically telling me that this is the common word usage and I'm trying to change the meaning. No, in fact, Flew, by his own mission, says he was proposing a new definition of the term. So in order for your paradigm to make any sense and your argument to make sense, you would have to say that Flew, who was a professional philosopher of religion, was completely unaware of this lack of belief definition, and that he was just delusional into thinking that he was proposing a new definition. Well, I'm not buying that, folks. You can buy that if you want. There's a bridge for sale down the block if you need one. Now, also, it's quite interesting that in the Psalm chapter 14, verse 1, what does the Bible define atheism as? In Psalm 14:1, it says what? The fool says in his heart that there is no God. Okay? He doesn't say I lack belief in God. All right? So this definition of the proposition that there is no God goes back into ancient times. All right? Now, don't give me this etymological business about the word atheism, and means no or without, and theism, we know what that means, so it's not a theist or without theism, meaning without a god or gods, okay? Anyone knows when studying languages that simply just looking at the etymology and the roots of the word doesn't necessarily, number one, tell you what the definition of it properly is. And even in this case, it just means without God or no God, okay? But it doesn't tell us what the person actually believed, if they asserted that there was no God or not. However, when we look in classical dictionaries and we look at the people in history who actually were atheists, okay, they themselves declared that there is no God. Okay, so I challenge you to do a historical survey of this issue and come back with the information. Okay, now I don't want secondary sources from someone nowadays saying this is what the people said. I want primary source material from the atheists themselves claiming that the historical and classical definition is what you're saying it is. Okay, and if so, then Flew was completely delusional and thought he was bringing a new definition, but it wasn't anything new. Interestingly enough, I mean, this is really irrelevant, but it's interestingly enough for those who don't know Antony Flew, look him up. He actually became a deist later in his life, and he goes on in a book to tell his story about why that is and what the arguments and evidence for a creator are. Now, the second part of this video, I'm going to go into evidence for God's existence. Okay? Look, people. If you want to keep this definition, that's completely fine with me. Just like the people who nowadays are trying to redefine the English language and use new gender pronouns and refer to themselves, one person, as they, them, or we. I mean, it's just completely absurd. And with this type of behavior, society is just going to be lost, really. But look, you can go with the definition of lack of belief in God if you want. I just want to show you why that is, okay? Because it's specifically to get you out of the burden of proof problem. It's really just an act of cowardice, okay? Because in your heart, you know that you believe that there is no God. But you know, once you put that position out there, now you have to defend it. And I find that atheists are really intellectually dishonest. They just claim that they don't have a position. In reality, they do, but they just can't defend it, or at least don't want to defend it, and just want to sit back and attack the theist. Well, I have no time for those kind of games. You can have your position, and I'll go on and present my evidence after I show you that what you're talking about as far as the definition of atheism, you really have no idea what you're talking about. Now, I will at least attempt to take the burden of proof on me in this discussion. I am asserting that there is a God, okay? Now, the typical atheist response is there's no evidence that God exists. So what evidence do you have for us, Jake? Well, the evidence that I have, okay, one argument which I briefly went over in the last video was what is known as the Kalam cosmological argument, okay? I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, inshallah, in this video, and explain to you what this argument actually is. Well, what is the Kalam cosmological argument? It is a deductive argument, and in this argument it concludes that there is a cause and creator of the universe. Okay, so what does it say? P1, premise 1 is, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. The conclusion, therefore the universe had a cause. It's really a simple argument for you to memorize and use. Now, let's now take a look at premise 1. What is the evidence for premise 1? The fact that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Is this true? Well, listen. First of all, this is not a new argument that I'm proposing. It's an argument that was proposed by the ancients and the likes of Imam Ghazali and numerous others. But typically, the atheist response to this argument has always been to deny premise 2, you see, because in order to get out of the conclusion of a deductive argument, if the structure of the argument is logically valid, and that means that the conclusion follows from the premises, the only way to get out of the conclusion is to deny the truthfulness of one or more of the premises. So typically, the atheists have accepted that premise 1 is true and have denied that premise 2 is true. They said that the universe was past eternal. Bertrand Russell is famous for saying the universe just is. Okay? But now there's so much scientific evidence that the universe is not past eternal and had an absolute beginning, okay, that now it has been reversed and they're attempting to deny the truthfulness of premise 1. So, what is the evidence that premise 1 is true? Well, whatever begins to exist has a cause is a premise that's constantly verified in our everyday experience and within science itself and has never been falsified. Now, to claim that something can come from nothing, which is the opposite of how premise 1 is stated, is actually worse than magic, because as a famous Christian philosopher says, who is Dr. William Lane Craig, he states that at least in magic, you have the magician, the rabbit, and the hat, and he somehow pulls the rabbit out of the hat. But if something can come from nothing, then that's worse than magic, because there is no magician in that case. There's not even a rabbit or a hat, you see? So basically, it's a principle that's constantly verified and has never been falsified. Now, atheists claim in regards to quantum physics that this gives us an example in which premise 1 is falsified, but I'm going to go into more detail about that objection after. Now, what about premise 2, that the universe began to exist? Is this true? Well, as I said, typically, atheists have hid behind this fact and assumed that the universe was just past eternal as a way to get out of this argument. Okay? Now, what actually is the evidence for premise 2? Well, the ancients primarily used philosophical arguments to prove that the universe is not past eternal, and that's because their lack of scientific knowledge and tools at the time. But now we have both. But first I'm going to go over the philosophical arguments for premise 1. So a sub-deductive argument for premise 2 goes something like this. If the universe is eternal, an actually infinite number of events have occurred. Premise 2. An actually infinite number of events cannot occur. Conclusion, therefore the universe is not eternal. Okay, so this argument, basically premise 1 is pretty much unobjectionable. If the universe is eternal, then an infinite number of past events have already occurred up until this point. Typically, atheists try to deny premise 2 and say that an actually infinite number of things is possible and that the actual infinite in terms of mathematical actually exists. Okay? So let's investigate whether or not this is actually true. Now, what is the mathematical infinite? Well, George Cantor in the early 1900s is really famous for expounding on what is known as set theory and infinite set theory. And he defined the infinite set as this. Let's see. He defined the infinite set as a set which the subset is equal to the whole, you see. So any set is infinite just so long as a subset of that infinite set is equal or equivalent to the whole set, you see. And in the last video, I gave an argument from Imam Ghazali in which he showed the absurdity of the actually infinite. He asked us to imagine 3 planetary objects in motion. Let's take the sun just for the sake of argument. And let's take the Earth and Mars rotating around the sun. So he asks us to imagine that the Earth rotates around the sun once a year. Okay? So that means 1 revolution per year. Now, Mars goes around the sun, okay, twice per year. Now imagine that this is happening from eternity. Now the question becomes now, us sitting here now, how many times has the Earth gone around the sun? Well, you would have to say an infinite number of times. But he says, now what about Mars? You would have to say an infinite number of times it's gone around the sun. But intuitively, that doesn't seem to make sense, because Mars has gone around the sun double the amount of times that the Earth has, you see. So this is just to show the absurdity of the actual infinite. And as George Cantor has defined the actual infinite set as a set which it's a part of it is equal to the whole. Well, that's just, in logic, is a logical fallacy to equivocate a part of something to the whole of something. That's known as a fallacy in logic, you see. And why is that? Because it winds up causing contradictions, you see. And so the example that Ghazali put out there is an illustration to show the absurdity of the actual infinite. It's an argument ad absurdum. Okay? Now, what do other popular mathematicians say about this subject? Well, there's a fellow by the name of David Hilbert, who was a brilliant mathematician. And I'm going to give you a quote about what he said about the infinite. He says, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role of the infinite, the role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." Okay? Now, Hilbert, as I told you guys last time, you can go online and search Hilbert's Hotel. The whole point of his illustration, it's basically analogous to Imam Ghazali's illustration, is to show that the actual infinite contributes to absurdities. You wind up having absurdities when dealing with an actual infinite set, okay? And so this is not a theistic bias. This is a brilliant mathematician, David Hilbert, who gives this illustration to show that the actual infinite doesn't exist in reality. It just plays the role of an idea, okay? Now this is to distinguish between what is known as potential infinite and actual infinite. The potential infinite can exist. And that's something in mathematics that serves as a limit, that you can just keep dividing a certain number. We have no problem with that. But an actual infinite, which is more of a number, okay, doesn't exist in reality. Just think about it. What is infinity minus 1? You have no answer, because you can't count down from infinity, nor can you count up to infinity, even if you had an infinite amount of time, because it's just that of an idea. It doesn't exist in actual reality. Okay. Now in regards to the original second premise that the universe began to exist, that is the philosophical evidence. But what about the scientific evidence? Well, we have enormous scientific evidence, okay, that the universe began to exist. Now, what actually is that evidence? Okay, well, we have the evidence from the expanding universe, the standard Big Bang model of the universe, the BGV theorem, okay, the cosmic microwave background that we are able to see. All of these things, okay, point to a complete beginning of the universe where all time, matter, space, and energy came into existence. Okay? Now, what do cosmologists say about this? I'm going to read a quote from Alexander Verlankin, who was a main contributor to the BGV theorem. What does he say about this? He says, and this is very important, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even unreasonable men. an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now that is very telling from an agnostic cosmologist. At another point, Alexander Vilenkin also said this: all the evidence we have says the universe had a beginning. Okay? So don't try to accuse me of any bias here, folks. I'm quoting an agnostic cosmologist. He says that you can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. The universe had a beginning. You just got to face it and try to deal with it another way. So he says that premise 2, the atheist or theist, whoever, you can't deny premise 2. So because of that, that's why it has shifted to now denying premise 1, which is really just completely absurd. Why don't we see, things popping into existence out of nothing all the time? If it happened with the universe, why don't we see horses pop into being? Why doesn't I see a coffee maker just appear in front of me? We never experience that. So it's constantly verified and never falsified. Now, it's sometimes stated that quantum effects can occur without causes. Now, first of all, this is based on an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which there's that variety of interpretations of quantum mechanics. It's really in its early stages. Now, there are several deterministic interpretations that are just as valid as the indeterministic ones and are empirically equivalent. So it's not a settled matter. So you can't use an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics as some kind of proof that premise 1 is false, because it's not really yet settled whether the indeterministic interpretations are correct or the deterministic. And in fact, a lot of people believe that the deterministic ones are more likely to be true. So that objection to premise 1 hinges on an indeterministic interpretation of which we don't have firm ground to stand on. Secondly, the effects of the quantum vacuum don't come into being from nothing. They are a result of the quantum vacuum, which is not nothing. Nothing means not anything, not a thing. The quantum vacuum is not nothing. It is a physical system governed by physical laws that has physical properties. It is a sea of fluctuating energy and is far from nothing. So it's just absurd. Popular people like Lawrence Krauss say a universe from nothing, but they're really referring to the quantum vacuum, in which it's not nothing. Again, just like the term atheism, they're trying to redefine terms in order to get them out of a jam. It's really quite a shame. Now, let's see. So what can we say about the cause of the universe? Another popular objection is, what causes God? Well, now, if you notice, if they have this objection, they really didn't read premise 1. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause, which applies to the universe because it began to exist. Doesn't apply to the standard definition of God, which God is eternal, so he didn't begin to exist. So we're out of that problem. Now someone says, well, we accept the argument, but it doesn't show us that one God exists. What about multiple creators? My answer to that would be Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a principle in science and philosophy in which it stipulates that you should not postulate entities beyond necessity. What that means, if we have a particular data set and we have an explanation that can completely explain all the necessary data, then there's no reason for us to postulate an additional entity beyond that explanation. So the reason that this is relevant to this discussion is because one creator is necessary and sufficient in order to explain the data at hand. So there's absolutely no need to postulate in multiple creators or multiple gods based on this argument. Now, the person that wants to do that, if they're a polytheist or an atheist just trying to jug with us, well, now the burden of proof is on them because they have they are now postulating a new entity that isn't necessary to explain the data. So now the burden of proof is on them to explain why we should favor the multiple creators or multiple gods interpretation rather than a single creator. Okay? Now, what about the problem of in theology when it's typically said that God is infinite? Now, Jake, you just told us that there is no actual infinite. Well, there's a distinction that needs to be made. There's a difference between something that is quantitatively infinite in terms of mathematics and something that is qualitatively infinite. When we say that God is infinite, we're not saying that God is composed of parts and his number of parts is infinite. We're referring to God being qualitatively infinite. That is to say that God is all-knowing, that God is all-powerful, that God is omnipresent, that God possesses the omnis, so that he has certain attributes, and those attributes are to the infinite level, you see. So in terms of God's quantity, God is quantitatively one in the Muslim position. Okay? God is ahad. Okay? God is not multiple in this sense. So that's the distinction of the quantitative versus qualitative infinite. My argument was that the quantitative infinite doesn't exist in reality, and as I quoted from David Hilbert, he asserted the same thing. Now, we don't think of God as quantitatively infinite. God is one. That is the Muslim position. Okay? Now, I realize that we can go into much greater detail with this argument. I know that there's still going to be people out there that are going to be challenging me about the atheist definition. Look, go back to the history. Look at what Antony Flew said. I quoted it straight from the horse's mouth. I quoted from scientists and mathematicians on the infinite in the beginning of the universe. I gave evidence for each of these premises. In order to deny the conclusion, you have to deny one of the premises. So you have to deal with this. Now, what about the cause? Okay, what about the nature of the cause? Okay, the nature of the cause has to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, immensely powerful, immensely intelligent, and personal. Okay, now why is that the case, Jake? How do you get all these attributes just from this argument? Well, if the universe began to exist and the cause is the creator of the beginning of the universe and everything that exists, well then, we know from the Big Bang model and all that science tells us is that time, matter, space, and energy all came into being with the beginning of the universe. That means the creator of those things cannot possess those within his own nature. Otherwise, you'd have a contradiction because we're saying all those things began, but yet if the creator of those things had them, then it would be impossible for that to be the true beginning of time, space, matter, energy, etc. Okay, so the creator of those things must not possess those things within his own being. So by the fact that time, matter, space, and energy all had a unique, complete, ultimate beginning, that means the creator of those things must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and not be made of energy, you see? Now, Jake, you also said that the creator must be personal because he could be a deistic God. Well, problem with that is if the universe began to exist. So it's a temporal effect of an eternal creator or eternal God. Okay. Question now becomes, did the creator possess sufficient ability in order to create the universe? And obviously the answer is yes, because he did create the universe and everything that exists. So now the question becomes, if we had a temporal effect how do we get a temporal effect from an eternal cause? You see? Because you can think of it like this. Water is said to freeze at 0 degrees Celsius, right? So now if we had water that existed at 0 degrees Celsius from eternity, it must be frozen. It would be impossible to say that the water was not frozen. Why? Because the necessary and sufficient conditions for the effect were present. So it automatically necessitates that the cause would create the effect. Now, with God, the only way that we can have a temporal effect from an eternal cause is if it is a intelligent being endowed with freedom of the will in order to decide whether or not to exercise that will. So in that sense, that's one argument for the personal nature of the creator and the cause in this argument. Now, listen, I love my atheist brothers out there. You guys are really, you guys are really enthusiastic and zealous about your position, or I'm sorry, lack thereof position. I don't want to put that on you, okay? But I encourage you to watch this video. I'm open to criticisms. I try to respond as best as I can on the YouTube comments and on Facebook, etc. But in reality, I don't have time to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So if you bring up an interesting point, I will deal with it in a further video, inshallah. I hope for my Muslim brothers and sisters out here that this material is useful. I know it's somewhat dense for those of you who may be new to this discussion of atheism, but it's really just an introduction. I highly suggest you study these issues more in depth because the onslaught of atheism is coming, and we're at a time where it's becoming really popular, and we need to know and learn how to deal with atheism and learn how to defeat it. So like I said, I hope this information was useful for you. Please support my channel. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, like this video, comment on it. Feel free to share it on Facebook or whatever format you would like, and just let people know about it. Inshallah, I will see you next week. I look forward to it, and I'm not sure what the topic is going to be yet, but just stay tuned for that. All right, Assalamu alaikum.